Artificial intelligence, or AI, is the next great frontier. The development of increasingly powerful AI will revolutionize entire industries, economies, and governments, creating vast improvements in efficiency and economies of scale. Unfortunately, not all AI will bring about positive effects. For years now, militaries around the world have been experimenting with AI in their weapons systems, and the results are frightening. Autonomous weapon systems that have the ability to independently identify and destroy targets without any human intervention are no longer science fiction. They already exist today. And an arms race is underway between global superpowers to develop ever more powerful AI weapons. China, Russia, and the United States are the three main players, although a handful of other countries are also in the race. The emergence of AI has the potential to completely revolutionize warfare and, in so doing, threaten the relative peace that has held since the end of the Cold War. In this video, I'm going to break down what AI weapons already exist today, what they might look like in the near future, how the world's most powerful militaries are in an arms race to acquire these AI weapons, and why an AI arms race poses an existential threat to the human race. Here we go. AI can be broadly defined as any machine or system that is capable of performing tasks that, if performed by a human, would be said to require intelligence. So by extension, AI weapons will be any combat or combat support systems that incorporate AI to complete their tasks intelligently. AI can increase the speed, efficiency, and autonomy of weapon systems, leading to a force multiplication effect. But more specifically, what do these AI-powered weapons look like on the battlefield? Here are some examples. Let's start with unmanned or unpiloted vehicles, and these can be in the air, underwater, and on the ground. Using AI, some of these vehicles have the ability to autonomously search for and detect enemy combatants and potentially engage them. American Predator drones, for example, can operate in semi-autonomous modes where they search for targets without any human oversight. China has developed an autonomous underwater glider called the Sea Wing that can stay below the surface for months and is used to detect enemy ships and submarines. In Russia, the weapons manufacturer Kalashnikov has been creating combat robots that are equipped with machine guns. Next up, drone swarms. Distinct from single UAVs, drone swarms involve large numbers of small drones that autonomously operate in sync using something called swarm intelligence. These drones can be used for reconnaissance, target acquisition and engagement, communication jamming, and many other tasks. The People's Liberation Army of China recognizes the disruptive potential of this technique and believes that they can use it for something called saturation assaults that could overwhelm the defenses of high-value targets. For instance, potentially US fighter jets or aircraft carriers. In 2017, for example, China completed a test with 1,000 UAVs flying in formation, which was a world record at the time. Another terrifying application of AI in weapons system is with missiles. AI can enable missiles to detect threats and avoid them, all while simultaneously navigating towards their intended target, even at hypersonic speeds. The US Long-Range Anti-Ship Missile, or LRASM, which already exists, is a perfect example. After the weapons operator identifies the target and presses fire on the missile, it will dive to sea-skimming altitude to avoid the close-in defenses, and then size up the enemy fleet, locate its particular target, calculate the perfect point of impact to deal the most damage, and then avoid any obstacles on the way to hitting its target. And all of this is done completely autonomously. Using AI and a continuous stream of data, multiple LRASMs can launch a coordinated attack on an entire enemy fleet. Warships are another example of a weapon system that already incorporate AI. And for example, the US Aegis defense system, which is deployed on American destroyers, can autonomously track and follow enemy ships, shoot down incoming missiles, and engage enemy gunboats. In the world of cyber weapons and cyber defense, AI is becoming increasingly important. Automated cyber attacks and defense systems are already being developed because the speed at which these engagements are occurring is already too fast for humans to keep up. Finally, let's talk about war algorithms. This is a type of software that analyzes information in real time from the battlefield, develops an understanding of the situation, and then provides advice to the human decision makers. To give you an example, in Syria, Russia deployed a command center that depended upon AI. It used a self-teaching algorithm to analyze and summarize the massive amount of data that it received from multiple military and civilian sources, from base commander reports, and from satellite images. The algorithms analyze the data and then provide recommendations based on the machine learning process. AI weapons do exist now, and they're getting ever more powerful. So what might they look like in the near future? Well, we will likely continue to see incremental or even exponential increases in the ability of AI to outperform humans in complex tasks that require computing and analyzing massive amounts of data. So for example, an AI system that sifts through millions of satellite images to identify potential targets, or an autonomous drone that analyzes environmental data in real time to be able to react to things happening around it. It's just going to get better, faster, and more efficient. As robotics improve, there will also be an increase in the number of unpiloted vehicles that are capable of performing various complex tasks. For example, think of the Boston Dynamics Atlas robot and imagine that thing with a gun instead of arms. Scary stuff. Going even further than that is the possibility of artificial general intelligence. What is that? Well, it's meant to describe an AI that exhibits human-level intelligence across the full range of cognitive tasks. So think of a Terminator-style killer robot that can be used for all kinds of general-purpose tasks, as opposed to just narrowly defined tasks like identifying a target. Artificial general intelligence is only a theoretical possibility at this point, though, and there is no agreement on whether or not such a technology is even possible to create. If it did come into existence though, it's hard to even comprehend the cascading impacts that it would have on human life, including on warfare. Now let's talk about the arms race for these weapons and how it's affecting global security and humanity's chances for survival. The ancient Roman military strategist Vegetius said, "Si vis pacem, para bellum," which translates to, "If you want peace, prepare for war." The foundational element of an arms race is something called the security dilemma, which is a theory that says whenever one country tries to increase their own security, it actually ends up decreasing the security of other countries. To put this in more practical terms, it means when one country acquires new weapons in an attempt to beef up their own security, other countries, for example their opponents, are going to perceive an increased threat level. And from there, they will feel pressure to increase their own weapons and to go out and develop and acquire new weapons, and this sets off the spiral of an arms race. It leads to fear and uncertainty, and this generates the pressure to react to the decisions of what the other countries are doing. Failing to respond means that the balance of power shifts in favor of the first mover, which is of course an unacceptable situation for opponents, especially in an anarchic international arena. Examples of past arms races include the naval race to acquire dreadnought ships in the early 1900s, and of course the nuclear arms race that started in the 1950s between the US and the USSR and went on for several decades. In the current context, countries like Russia, China, and the US, which all have a lot to lose if their competitors achieve military superiority, are incentivized to spend huge amounts on weapons development, especially in areas that have the potential to revolutionize warfare, like AI. So now that we've established what AI weapons look like and why there's a massive emerging arms race to develop the most powerful AI arms possible, what are the implications? Will AI weapons make future conflict more likely? And can humanity survive another arms race? Let's examine the issue. First off, there's two different types of arms races that will lead to two different levels of threat to global security. We have qualitative and we have quantitative arms races. Quantitative arms races exist when there's competition between countries to increase the number of weapons or troops that they have. Qualitative arms races, on the other hand, are when there's competition between countries to build new and more effective weapons. So with AI, we are obviously in a qualitative competition, building new weapons as opposed to stockpiling old weapons. When it comes to the prospects for global peace, the fact that it's a qualitative AI arms race is actually really bad. Why? Because it means that there are greater chances for revisionist powers to overtake their opponents, i.e. China and Russia could potentially overtake the US in military superiority. This is the case because revolutionary new technologies have the power to make previous weapon systems completely obsolete, undermining any numerical advantages that may have existed prior to the advent of the new technology. The stakes are high for all parties here, since the loser of an AI arms race might face an existential threat. Understanding this, the US has an incentive to invest heavily now in order to avoid falling behind in the qualitative portion of this AI arms race. On the other hand, both Russia and China have an incentive to invest quickly as well, before the window for gaining an advantage over the Americans passes. The fact that all three countries surely realize this will amplify the speed and the urgency of the arms race, which will also compound all of the other risks of AI arms. Speaking of other risks, there may be an increased likelihood that AI arms are used as compared to conventional or even nuclear weapons. The reason for this is that autonomous weapons put fewer soldiers' lives at risk. So once a military decides that they trust AI weapons enough to actually deploy them, the likelihood of those weapons being used in combat and the risks taken in combat may increase. Reducing the risk of human casualties frees a military to be bolder because when autonomous weapon systems engage in combat, the only direct costs will be financial and not in human lives. AI weapon systems are also more likely to be tested and used in combat than nuclear weapons because the single use of a conventional AI weapon does not constitute an existential threat to a country in the same way that a nuclear attack would. The threat of mutually assured destruction has kept nations from engaging in nuclear warfare for a very long time. And what that means is, when one country shoots a nuclear device at another, then the opponent is obviously going to retaliate and then everybody will end up dead because they all launch all of their nukes.
Meanwhile, Australia is down there like, WCF, mate?
Since conventional AI weapons won't have that same brute destructive force, for example, a drone with a machine gun attached to it, the principle of mutually assured destruction will not apply and countries will have less incentive to show restraint. So the AI arms race might be less stable than the Cold War for that reason. Speaking of mutually assured destruction, AI also has the potential to upend the stability that nuclear deterrence has brought since the Cold War. Currently, countries like the US, Russia, and China each have enough nuclear weapons with protected second strike capabilities that if any of them was to launch a nuclear attack against the others, then there would be time for a retaliatory strike and everybody would end up dead. A recent report from RAND suggests that in 20 years, AI technology might be advanced enough to actually process sensor data so quickly and creatively that it can locate with high precision an enemy's mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles, meaning those that are moved around on trucks or submarines. If this is true, then it would undermine nuclear deterrence because countries could reduce the second strike capabilities of their opponents by launching a preemptive attack. And if the threat of a retaliatory strike is removed, that means that there's actually an advantage to move first or to preempt the opponents, which could result in a serious reduction in global security and an increase in the possibility of nuclear warfare. If a country believes that they can get a solid attack off and completely neutralize their opponent before a reaction is even possible, then the threat of mutually assured destruction disappears and all bets are off. Next, let's talk about the speed of engagement. Increasing the speed of engagements is another way in which AI has the potential to destabilize warfare. AI weapons already offer speed and precision that is unmatched by any human, and the faster the pace of warfare, the easier it is for mistakes or miscalculations to be amplified. Additionally, when the pace of warfare exceeds the cognitive ability of their human overseers, the risks of escalation increase, and the agency of the individuals that would normally pull the trigger is diminished. This is obviously a problem because AI does not do well with uncertainty and unpredictability. So as the trend towards greater speed continues, the possibilities for escalation in times of tension will get bigger and bigger, and the prospects for global peace and stability will be diminished. When it comes to containment, AI arms will be more difficult to contain than other weapons systems, which is another significant threat to global stability. The fact that most AI will have both civilian and military use, combined with the fact that most of the significant advances in AI technology to date have been made by private corporations, means that these technologies will be much more accessible to the average person than the weapons of past arm races. It's much easier to go out and buy a drone and weaponize it than it is to go out and buy a nuclear device. So that means that AI weapons could easily fall into the hands of rogue states, terrorists, lone wolves, or just anybody with the resources to grab them. And if AI weapons fall into the wrong hands and become widely proliferated before the full extent of their implications are known, the effects could be disastrous. So now that I've established just how threatening an AI arms race will be, Let's end on a slightly more positive note. Is there any chance to escape the arms race, or at least prevent conflict before it's too late? Well, there may be a window of opportunity to do just that. Since the arms race is currently embryonic, there is more likelihood of cooperation and trust building among rivals. If superpowers get together soon and agree to limit the development and application of AI to at least certain classes of weapons, like hypersonic missiles that could completely destroy an enemy's second strike capabilities, for example, that could be an escape route. That said, the window of opportunity is very small. Once the arms race matures and the spiral of competitive behavior is fully in motion, coming back from the brink will be very, very difficult. But how do we create trust and cooperation in an environment of fear and uncertainty? Well, there are a few strategies that have worked in the past. First, all parties have to agree to reduce uncertainty by agreeing to disclose information on their capabilities and their intent. Second, if countries focus on building defensive weapons rather than offensive weapon systems, this can help to decrease the threat perception in the international arena. Third, countries can try to limit the incentive for preemptive attacks, for example, by agreeing to limitations on weapons that are capable of destroying second strike capabilities. Fourth, countries can try to increase the avenues for communication to avoid accidental escalation if anything ever happened. So for example, they could establish direct phone lines and points of contact. And this is a strategy that was actually used during the Cold War and potentially prevented several nuclear incidents. Whether or not any of these strategies will actually work is anybody's guess though. For any of it to have a chance, world leaders first need to agree to meet and address the issues, which has not happened yet. There have been arms limitations in the past that were successful. For example, limitations on testing nuclear weapons and limitations on the number of nuclear weapons that the US and the USSR were stockpiling. We can only hope that some of these past successes can be replicated in the world of AI before it's too late and we all end up dead.